Chapter 23. What kind of help would we need? More light! More light! Let's take stock of our conclusions so far. To be completely happy, to enjoy not just the fragmentary and imperfect happiness of the present life, but complete and utter fulfillment, we must see God as He is in Himself, behold Him with our minds. For this to be possible, our minds must be lifted above their natural powers, which are sufficient only for knowing created things, not for beholding their uncreated cause. Moreover, it seems that we must seek this ultimate goal with a pure heart and a single gaze. All other desires would have to be set in order by the sovereign desire. We would have to be cleansed, not of all other motives, but of any that would compete and distract from it. But we cannot uplift our intellects beyond their natural limits, and we cannot heal the disorder of our desires. We would therefore need help from God Himself, if He would give it. People speak of many roads to God, but so far as I am aware, only one faith tradition speaks of the possibility of divine help in just this way. I am speaking of biblical religion, both Old and New Testament, culminating in the sacrifice of the God who took our burdens upon Himself so that we could be relieved of them. St. Peter even links the two requisites of complete fulfillment that we have discussed when he remarks that through the promises of Christ, His followers can escape from the corruption that is in the world because of passion, that is, be healed of the disorder of their desires, and become partakers of the divine nature, that is, be taken into the mystery of His interior life. This leaves us with a problem. If the tradition in question is true, it is excellent news. On the other hand, it presents itself not as a human invention or discovery, not as yet another theory worked out by philosophers proposing yet another way by which man reaches up to God, but as a divine gift by which God Himself reaches down to man. Obviously, if that is really true, if it really is a divine gift, something that our reasoning could not have worked out by itself, then we would be unable to ascertain whether it were true just by reasoning. We would have to lay aside the method we have been following all through this book. Or would we? For the resources of reasoning alone are not yet exhausted. We can still ask reason about whether it could be reasonable to trust information that purports to come from beyond our power to attain it. Let's tackle these difficulties one by one. In the next chapter, I will consider in what sense faith may cooperate with reason, and in what sense it requires a step beyond it. Is it reasonable to accept help from beyond human reason, or is it blind and irrational? But in the present chapter, I will consider just what the tradition proposes that we believe. First, about the vision of God Himself, and second, about the healing of our interior disorder. What does the tradition suppose the vision of God to be? It admits that not a great deal can be said about it. The faithful have only flashes and glimpses of God's countenance in this life. As St. Paul says, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall understand fully, even as I have been fully understood." Faith, in other words, is not direct knowledge, but only a foretaste of knowledge. Obviously, then, we can't say, in seeing God, this is what we would see. But at least we can clarify some things about what it would and would not be to see Him. First, we must be very clear about what an enormous gap such a vision would close, and in what sense it would close it. The tradition maintains that God has already given us the astonishing gift of bearing His image. We are not like the plants or the beasts. In our finite powers to reason, love, and freely choose, we resemble Him, yet the difference between the original and the image remains infinite. God isn't the same as me. He isn't a part of me, and He isn't a higher me. I'm not the same as Him. I'm not a part of Him, and I'm not a spark or splinter of Him. Nor will I ever be. He doesn't depend on anything else, because He is what everything else depends on. He can't be explained by anything else because he is what everything else must be explained by. He is unutterably beyond me. To know him would not be like knowing a sum in a workbook, or even the central theorem of a geometry book. In the vision of God, our minds would be taken up with consuming intimacy into the vastness of his own life. This would be true knowledge, far closer than I know my wife or dearest friend, unimaginably closer than I know myself, in its finite way, like the way he infinitely knows me, personally calling me by name. Even so, my knowledge would not encompass the divine life, because nothing at all can make a finite mind like mine infinite like his. God encompasses what he is in the very act of understanding it. But although my mind might be uplifted to see what he is, I would not encompass what he is. To comprehend him in that sense, to intellectually take in his infinity, one would have to be God himself, which is impossible for us. It follows that the vision of God is not complete in the sense that those enjoying it understand God's being so fully that there is nothing more to be known. No finite being attains to that. In this sense, our knowledge is not and cannot be perfect. Yet in another sense, it can be. For rather than merely knowing about God, they know God. And because in this consuming experience they behold him as he is in himself, they are satisfied. And what does the tradition propose with reference to the healing of our disorder? More can be said on this question than on the previous one, because the healing begins in this life. God, having made us free, will not heal our disorder without our assent. Therefore, everything depends on the yes, the willing affirmation that the patient gives to the divine physician. For unless the patient is reconciled with the surgeon, nothing else can be done. How does this come about? Nothing I can offer in atonement for my moral failures is sufficient, but an atonement has been offered by God himself on my behalf. The tradition claims that by vicariously sharing in the death and resurrection of Christ, I am able to die to myself and live in him, something I could never have done on my own. Thinkers in the tradition have offered a number of theories of how the atonement works, but they all affirm that it does. To speak of Christ may seem a little too concrete for comfort. Must we be so definite? But the tradition does not concede that there are many ways to God. There are many religions, and they are not all wrong about everything, but for the sickness of alienation, only one medicine has been provided. If the patient, let us say it is me, continues to cooperate with the divine physician, instead of pulling loose or struggling against the treatments, then the work of putting my thoughts, emotions, and desires in proper order can proceed. An essential element in the treatment is that I come to realize more and more clearly and sharply that God himself is the supreme good from whom all created goods I desire come, and for the sake of which they all exist. Although some ways of pursuing these lesser goods can be directed to the supreme good that is himself, others cannot. But as the treatment continues, a series of changes ripple and cascade through me. Not all of this will be visible to others. Perhaps very little will be. We must remember that before the treatment begins, I am cut off from the divine life, morally and spiritually sick and dying. Yet a great deal takes place. For example, although even apart from God, I would have been able to develop a certain degree of moral discipline just by working at it, I would have eventually met a wall. Everyone does. When I find myself doing the wrong I do not want to do, and not doing the right that I want to do, I am now able to turn to his grace for assistance. Speaking of grace, certain supernatural virtues depend on grace for their very existence. Chief among these is divine love. Apart from God, I may love my wife with natural love and affection, but I will fail in that supernatural charity that enables me to see that since she is made in his image, The only true way to love her for her own sake is to love her for His sake, to participate in His love for her, which is so inconceivably greater than my own. This possibility is now offered to me. Trust in God restores confidence in conscience. If I do not believe that He made us, then it is almost impossible to resist the suspicion that the authority of conscience is an illusion, that whatever we think about right and wrong is but the meaningless and purposeless result of a process that did not have us in mind. What could a ragtag collection of impulses and inhibitions left over from the accidents of natural selection have to teach us? Better to be done with it. But if conscience is an emissary of the Creator, matters stand otherwise. Such trust in the Creator of conscience also makes it possible not to despair when conscience accuses. Only a person can forgive. Consequently, apart from Him, the moral law will seem not a gift, but a harsh accuser with a heart of rock. When I have done wrong, I will long to drown out its voice. The greater my determination to do so, the worse I am likely to become. For example, having treated you badly, I may soothe my conscience by convincing myself that you deserved it, and then, believing it, I may treat you still worse. I may even tell myself that the solution to the problem of guilt lies in pills, or in the theory that there is no such thing as guilt. But if behind the law stands its author, then when conscience does confront me, I can submit to the grace of a change of heart and return to Him. At last I can experience the moral law not as a stone that breaks my foot, but as a step on which to stand and rest. Moreover, if I cooperate with God, I am relieved of the urge to do evil in order to make things turn out right. It is all very well to say, do the right thing and let God take care of the consequences. But this counsel will hardly seem convincing unless I am confident of a God who will one day bring everything to justice and wipe the tears from the eyes of the oppressed. By contrast, if I am fully convinced that He is in command, then I am no longer tempted to play God myself. Confidence in the promises of faith also restores courage when we find ourselves in moral difficulties. Apart from Him, I will constantly seem to find myself in dilemmas in which no course of action is innocent. I will be tempted to agree with those philosophers who say that dirty hands are merely a condition of human existence, something we shouldn't fret about. But the tradition promises that if we are faithful to God, then He is faithful to us. He will not let you be tempted beyond your strength, but with the temptation will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. But there is a problem. Before reaching this chapter, we proceeded by reasoning, but now we have brought in claims of faith. Can it be reasonable for humans to believe something from beyond human reason? Chapter 24. How can we get that help? Test everything. The whole point of revelation is that it exceeds what we could have figured out for ourselves. But can it be reasonable to submit to such help? Certainly it is reasonable to submit to help from beyond my own reason. I don't know tensor calculus, but I would be a fool not to accept the results of the calculations of someone who does. The case of revelation is a little different, because I must accept on faith certain things that cannot be found out by any human reasoning, not just my own. Yet even here we are speaking of the communication of information by a mind, one that is greater than ours. A reasonable person would ask 5 things about revelation: whether it is possible, necessary, likely, authentic, and confirmed. Now, it is certainly reasonable to consider revelation possible, because although its truth cannot be philosophically demonstrated, the reality, power, wisdom, and goodness of God Himself can be. It is reasonable to consider it necessary, because even though we have a natural inclination to seek the truth about God, our unassisted finite minds could never know His own mind. and it is reasonable to consider it likely, because he who gave us the inclination to seek him must desire that we find him. Is it reasonable to consider revelation authentic? This point is stickier, but the record of revelation, including events that are difficult to explain apart from divine intervention, is well attested by witnesses who are not easily discredited. Some people object to the miraculous on principle, but it is hardly cricket to say that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and then rule out extraordinary evidence. Finally, is it reasonable to consider revelation confirmed? This point is sticky too, but assent to the revelation is accompanied by the experience of grace. Granted, we are not speaking of knowledge that can be confirmed from the outside, but consider an analogy. There are certain things my wife and I understand about each other that we could never have come to know apart from the love that makes each of us second nature to the other. Even so, we have reason to be confident about these things. As we have seen earlier, inside knowledge is not to be dismissed out of hand. Moreover, the relationship between faith and reason works in both directions. Not only does reason come to the cleansing aid of faith, but faith enables reason to reach farther, to ask better questions, to become in every way more fully what it is meant to be. At least 4 good reasons can be given for this claim. In the first place, revelation allows reason to work with greater confidence, because it provides us with additional grounds to believe that human intelligence is a gift of the divine intelligence, given to us for knowledge, rather than merely a haphazard, undependable hodgepodge that happened to come together in a process that was not planned. In the second place, revelation provides certainty, at least relative certainty, because although God would be incapable of error, man could err in the interpretation of what God had disclosed about points that are in principle within the scope of reason, but about which our reasoning might err. In the third place, revelation provides new data, illuminating reality more deeply than reason could have done on its own. For example, there is the historical fact of the fall, explaining why our hearts are so divided against themselves. And there is the promise that this interior dislocation in the core of our being can be cured. Finally, revelation calls the mind's attention to a great many things that it should have been able to find out on its own, but may not have. Even in everyday experience, we fail to notice things that should be obvious, like the fact that I am holding my lost glasses in my left hand. In the same way, we may be nearly blind to the facts of created reality until their creator says, "Look here," and then we can see them. Consider, for example, the idea that human beings are persons, that they are not just whats, but whos. This insight has transformed the West. Most people do not consider the notion of personhood particularly religious, yet it did not enter Western thought until the early controversies about the nature of the Trinity. Of course, even granted that it may be reasonable to believe and assent to revelation, one must still take that step of believing and assenting. I am standing at an upper-floor window of a burning hotel. Someone calls to me from below, "Jump, we'll catch you!" "Who are you?" I cry. "We're firemen. We have a net. Jump, now!" "But I can't see you. There's too much smoke." "You don't have to see us. We can see you. Jump!" "But I might break my neck. How can I believe you're who you say you are? How can I believe you will catch me?" "Trust us. Jump!" Though I may have every reason to believe that the unseen firefighters will catch me in their net, I may not trust them enough to overcome my fear, and so, hesitating, I may burn to death. Obviously, my reasons are not the same as trust. Trust surpasses reason. Even so, my reasons are reasons for trust. So with religious faith. Though it surpasses reason, it is not irrational. Underlying the challenge, what does faith have to do with reason, is an assumption, usually unexamined, that faith and reason are at odds with each other. This supposition makes interesting bedfellows, For it is the one point that extreme secularists and extreme fundamentalists have in common. The former imagine that by rejecting faith, they are choosing reason. The latter imagine that by rejecting reason, they are choosing faith. Though it may come as a surprise to both groups, Christianity has historically rejected both of these views, holding that disciplined faith and disciplined reason are not enemies, but allies. John Paul II remarked that they are like the two wings of a bird, both of them necessary to fly. In fact, rejecting faith leads not to putting reason in place of faith, but to unreasonable faith. Consider, for example, the unofficial established religion of secular universities, like the one where I teach. The university does not insist that there is no God. However, one is strongly expected to act as though, if there were a God, he could not make a difference to anything else, especially to one's scholarship. In other words, one is supposed to believe at most in an irrelevant God. Notice that this stance does not make the secular university neutral among religions. On the contrary, it puts it diametrically at odds with Christianity, for the Christian faith believes in a relevant God, who does make a difference to everything, including scholarship, since he is the first truth on which every other truth depends. And there is more. If I consider God irrelevant, it does not follow that I do not worship any God at all. What follows is that I bow to different supreme concerns, different unconditional loyalties. Although such deities are not usually acknowledged, in effect I am worshiping gods other than God. Historically, Christianity has proposed reasons for trusting in the God that it professes and adores. It proposes a reasonable faith. But the intellectual culture of my secular university does not propose reasons for trusting in the gods to which it bends the knee. Gods such as conformity, approval, recognition, status, power, self-importance, and self-will. It does not even know the knee is bent. In the name of reason, it pursues an unreasonable faith. Christianity has delved more deeply into these matters than other religions because of its teaching that God himself is interested in us and desires that we know him. Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger wrote that in the early days of Christianity, in an environment teeming with gods, when believers were asked to which God their God corresponded, the answer ran, to none of them, to none of the gods to whom you pray, but solely and alone to him to whom you do not pray, to that highest being of whom your philosophers speak. But there was a difference, for the philosophers who spoke of this highest being would never have dreamed of praying to him. By contrast, by deciding exclusively in favor of the God of the philosophers and logically declaring this God to be the God who speaks to man and to whom one can pray, the Christian faith gave a completely new significance to this God of the philosophers, removing him from the purely academic realm and thus transforming him. Ratzinger concludes, this God of the philosophers, whose pure eternity and unchangeability had excluded any relation with the changeable and transitory, now appeared to the eye of faith as the God of men, who is not only thought of all thoughts, the eternal mathematics of the universe, but also agape, the power of creative love. But don't thousands of religions claim divine revelation? Actually, most don't. For example, Siddhartha Gautama Buddha did not claim divine revelation. In fact, he seems to have denied that there are any divinities, and the Theravada branch of Buddhism continues this tradition. The Greeks did not claim divine revelation. They worshipped the gods of the poets, myths blending loveliness and horror, gleams of celestial strength and beauty falling on a jungle of filth and imbecility. Santeria does not claim divine revelation. Its rituals are a syncretic borrowing from a number of religions, with the aim of bargaining with the gods for power. Some contemporary religions, such as Wicca, are more or less consciously made up. Their practitioners do not claim that their teachings are revealed truths, but that they find these teachings pleasing and empowering. In fact, Just 3 major religions do claim divine revelation in historical rather than forgotten mythical time. Judaism, which Christianity considers its older brother, Christianity itself, which believes itself to be the fulfillment and extension of the promises God made to the Jews, and Islam, which relativizes both Jewish and Christian revelation, regards Jesus as just another prophet, and retreats to a more primitive understanding of God. This puts Christianity in a special position. Christianity claims that information exceeding everything that human reason can discover, but with keen bearing on the reasonable questions we have been pursuing in this book, has actually been disclosed by God Himself in historical time. This chapter has not proven the claim. I hope it has shown that it is reasonable. In fact, it seems that by the light of revelation, the mind is able not only to see more clearly those things that lie within its natural reach, but also to understand and explain many other features of the world that would otherwise have remained utterly baffling. If this is true, then when reason rejects revelation, it is not being more true to itself, but less. Only illuminated by God can it come into its own. The hope of the faith is that one day our thoughts may be lit not only by the reflected light of revelation, but by the direct illumination of the face of God Himself, that although now our minds only smolder, one day they will blaze like suns. Chapter 25. The Paradoxes of Perfect Fulfillment. Life is not an illogicality, yet it is a trap for logicians. Happiness is paradoxical. I don't mean that the idea of happiness is absurd or self-contradictory. A paradox is something that at first glance may seem absurd or self-contradictory, but isn't. The topic of happiness is full of such paradoxes. We encountered several of them in the very first chapter above. Oddities about happiness that present such a stumbling block that some people throw up their hands and say we shouldn't pursue happiness at all. Recall, for instance, the paradox that those who are always asking, "How can I be happy?" are the very ones least likely to be happy. This is quite true. But why is it true? Because obsession with my happiness focuses my attention on myself, but my happiness lies in something outside myself, in the vision of God in His own being. To be fulfilled, I must stop worrying about my fulfillment, yet I must pursue and desire that in which my fulfillment lies, which is God. No doubt when I begin to pursue God, my focus is on my own fulfillment in Him. Yet fulfillment in Him comes not because I think more and more about my fulfillment, but because I think less and less about my fulfillment and more about Him. So when the tradition declares that a man must lose himself to find himself, there could hardly be a greater paradox, and yet there could hardly be a greater literal truth. I don't expect this fact to be obvious from outside the experience itself, but it shouldn't be altogether obscure either, because so many things about even earthly loves bear the stamp of the paradox that you must lose yourself to find yourself. Consider marriage. My wife and I are immensely enriched by our care for each other. But how can we be? How can it be wonderful to have someone else to worry about, twice the care? Yet it is. I would die for her. How can that make sense? But not to do so if she were in danger would be a greater death to me than death would be. Or consider having children. Offspring convert us. They force us to become different beings. They plunge into our lives, filling their diapers, consuming time and attention, using up disposable income, upsetting all our comfortable arrangements, and nobody knows how they will turn out. Many couples decline to have any children at all, preferring what is sometimes called the child-free lifestyle because it leaves them more at liberty to do what they like. A puzzled writer who stops barely short of condemning all childbearing says, nevertheless, I don't have the answer to the origin of the longing for children that many experience. It's almost certainly due to a complex mixture of biological and social factors. It might even be an evolutionary trick. Oh, happy trick that won for us so glorious a blessing. Willy-nilly, children knock us out of our complacent habits and force us to live outside ourselves. They are the necessary and natural continuation of that shock to our egotism, which is initiated by marriage itself, and we are the better for it. So perhaps it is not inconceivable that to find ourselves we must lose ourselves. I cannot urge strongly enough that this is best done with others. We saw earlier that even the most perfect earthly love always leaves something to be desired. But what better use of earthly love could there be than for friends or lovers to walk together into that divine mystery, which is so much greater than themselves? Supreme happiness presents other paradoxes too. One of them is that suffering and unhappiness in this life can conform us more closely to the God in whom our ultimate happiness lies. I don't mean that suffering becomes comfortable, or that unhappiness becomes sweet, but if the atonement really happened, if it is really true that the Son of God entered into our suffering and took the worst of it upon himself, then the face of pain changes. It would be impossible to offer our sorrow and heartache to a God who had never known pain. But if he has suffered for our sake, then we can offer our affliction to be joined, by his favor, with his own, so that it will prepare us more deeply to see him. There is no way to prove this from the outside, but centuries of the experience of faith testify to its truth. From this truth emerges another surprise. We saw earlier in this book that the fragmentary and incomplete happiness of the present life lies in the exercise of the virtues, along with a certain amount of good fortune, for otherwise the virtues have nothing on which to operate. But consider, if the deficiencies of good fortune, even suffering, can be turned by God's grace to our advantage, then doesn't this fact have implications not just for the perfect and complete happiness of seeing God, but even for fragmentary and incomplete happiness in the present life? The continuation of this paradox is another. In some sense, God sees to the needs of those who trust him, though the idea is ridiculous if taken in the sense of a well-known pop song. Oh, Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes-Benz? My friends all drive Porsches. I must make amends. Yet there is a very great advantage in not having too much of the ordinary blessings of this life, because then we are set free from the temptation to place our confidence in these blessings instead of in God. The tradition does not say that God is near to the well-off and saves the exalted in spirit. It says he is near to the broken-hearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Jesus goes so far as to tell the poor that they are blessed, that is, supremely happy. The point is not that supreme happiness lies in sickness, starvation, and homelessness, but that it lies in supreme reliance on God, an attitude rarely to be found among those who have, for the moment, everything that this world offers. But speaking of the ordinary blessings of life, doesn't Christ promise, "But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things shall be yours as well"? Obviously, there is no guarantee that every one of his followers will always have enough to pay the rent. But without dismissing the literal meaning of his expression, "all these things," we should notice that there is another way of taking it too. Addressing God himself, St. Augustine wrote, "Ambition seeks honor and glory, although you alone are to be honored before all and glorious forever. By cruelty the great seek to be feared, yet who is to be feared but God alone? From his power what can be wrested away, or when, or where, or how, or by whom? The caresses by which the lustful seduce are a seeking for love, but nothing is more caressing than your charity, nor is anything more healthfully loved than your supremely lovely, supremely luminous truth. Curiosity may be regarded as a desire for knowledge, whereas you supremely know all things. Ignorance and sheer stupidity hide under the names of simplicity and innocence. Yet no being has simplicity like to yours, and none is more innocent than you, for it is their own deeds that harm the wicked. Sloth pretends that it wants quietude, but what sure rest is there, save the Lord? Luxuriousness would be called abundance and completeness, but you are the fullness and inexhaustible abundance of incorruptible delight. Wastefulness is a parody of generosity, but you are the infinitely generous giver of all good. Avarice wants to possess overmuch, but you possess all. Enviousness claims that it strives to excel, but what can excel before you? Anger clamors for just vengeance, but whose vengeance is so just as yours? Fear is the recoil from a new and sudden threat to something one holds dear, and a cautious regard for one's own safety. But nothing new or sudden can happen to you. Nothing can threaten your hold upon things loved. And where is safety secure save in you? Grief pines at the loss of things in which desire delighted, for it wills to be like to you, from whom nothing can be taken away. Augustine's argument is that the only possible sense in which we can have everything is to have God. All of the created goods we desire are but pale reflections of the uncreated good that is Himself. In a twisted way, even those blown by the storms of greed and craving are trying to be like Him, who is all-sufficient. Thus, even those who go from you and stand up against you are still perversely imitating you, but by the mere fact of their imitation, they declare that you are the creator of all that is, and that there is nowhere for them to go where you are not. I have mentioned the paradoxical beatitude, "Blessed are the poor," but all of the beatitudes, all of Christ's maxims about supreme happiness, are paradoxical. The mourners, the meek, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, even the persecuted are called blessed, or supremely happy. These maxims are often misunderstood, I think. They are not commands, but declarations of how things are. Consider the mysterious saying, "Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God." We can view this from several perspectives. First, we can view it as providing answers to a set of questions. Who will be supremely happy? The sort of persons who are pure in heart. What is their delight? Seeing God. Why are they so delighted to see Him? Because by His grace working in them, they have become the kind of people who do long to see Him, for that is what a pure heart is. To those whose hearts are pure enough to long for Him, God promises satisfaction, and because they trust in His promise, they already have that foretaste of happiness, which is hope, even though in this life they do not yet have fulfillment. Second, we can view it as the solution to a riddle. Seeing God is the complete and consummate good of everyone, but not everyone wants it. We may prefer happiness to be what we want it to be, rather than what it is. God does not promise consummation to everyone who wants to be happy. He promises it to those who desire, above all, to have what happiness really is, which is Himself, and who cooperate with the grace by which He gives it. To them He gives such great goods, such incredibly wonderful blessings, that we would tremble to conceive them. But until we are right in our hearts, we cannot even recognize them as good. Thus, Christ is not saying that the pure of heart are supremely happy because they get the heart's desire of people with mixed motives and sullied hearts, like me. Rather, He is saying that they are supremely happy because they get the heart's desire of people whose hearts are pure. I must become that kind of person. I must give Him His way with me. I must allow Him to scour my heart and polish it until it can reflect His own light. I will in the end receive the object of my uttermost longing, but only if my uttermost longing is for the one thing that can satisfy it. At last, we come to the final paradox of perfect happiness, which is our present unfulfillment. Not yet being fulfilled is a sign not of something wrong, but of accurate perception. For we are not fulfilled here, and it is not the pretense of premature fulfillment that makes us happy. An ancient prayer refers to us as mourning and weeping in this vale of tears. St. Paul spoke searchingly of how we groan in the longing that what is mortal in us may be swallowed up by life. These very tears and groaning are promissory notes of joy, for if we were perfectly adapted to the way of the world, we would not have such tears and groanings. The ordinary satisfactions would satisfy us. I weep, therefore I rejoice. Blessed are those who refuse to drug their discontent with futile satisfactions. Supremely happy are those who settle for nothing less than supreme happiness. This concludes the reading of How and How Not to Be Happy by J. Budziszewski. Copyright 2022 by J. Budziszewski. This book is read by L.J. Ganser. This unabridged recording was published by arrangement with Regnery Publishing and was produced in 2022 by Blackstone Publishing, which holds the copyright. Neither this recording nor any portion of it may be reproduced or used for any purpose without prior written authorization from Blackstone Publishing. For a complete listing of our titles, visit our website at www.downpour.com. Thank you